Hello again, I'm Ruth and welcome to my second video on the beautiful collaborations between Zoetemelk Film, a Russian animation studio, and S4C, a Welsh television channel. S4C's head of animation Chris Grace was so impressed by Zoetemelk's film work on the Welsh stories Mabinogion that he knew they'd do amazing work on Shakespeare's plays, especially since they didn't want it to be Disney kitsch. The Elizabethan playwright is considered the greatest writer of the English language, so they adapted 12 of his 38 plays, including comedies, tragedies, and histories, although a couple of them might be considered romances because they don't quite fit into one genre. Each episode is 30 minutes long. In 1992 there was Series 1, and then in 1994 they released Series 2. In 1991 there was an abortive coup from hardline Russian communists to forcibly take over, which made working at the studio very difficult. In these conditions in Russia, it's amazing they finished the projects. I have the tie and hardback books for each series, with the condensed scripts by Leon Garfield and artwork by the Russian artists. It's the closest thing to having concept art books. These animations give me a profound feeling. The stop motion especially blows me away. My fifth favourite Shakespeare play from this series is Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. Hamlet was made on paint on glass, slow-drying oil paint, amazing to see on the behind the scenes, the same technique as they used for Richard III, which is also eerie and violent. You feel like you can almost see the frames in between. I think the translucent, sketchy style really suits the themes of death and madness that are in this play. They use high angles, like when you're going upstairs in a castle, and awkwardly look down at the dark shadows below. There's a lot of orange and green light as well. This story inspired the pilot episode of Lewis, one of my favourite detective series, because it's basically a modernised version set in Oxford. Hamlet starts with his uncle Claudius marrying his mother Gertrude because his father has just died. Hamlet then sees his father's ghost, who tells him that Claudius killed him. So he basically ruins his life. So unlike Lion King, where he says, "Remember who you are," and it sort of pushes him to take his rightful place as king, it ruins Hamlet's life. And I really don't get why Hamlet's father didn't go and haunt Claudius and make him feel suicidal. He's now burdened with this information, and his father wants him to take vengeance for him. Hamlet says the soliloquy to be or not to be because he really can't deal with this information. The king and Polonius, the king's advisor, think that Hamlet may be suffering from love of Ophelia, Polonius's daughter, but actually he says to Ophelia, "Get thee to a nunnery," which is really rude. And I would have just said back, "Get thee to a monastery." But she's really upset because they were sort of together and he's acting so weird at the moment. So it's not for love of her, it's because of what his father told him. He decides to organise a play for the king and queen, reenacting how the murder happened, which is poison through the ear. And Claudius reacts to this, so he now knows that Claudius is definitely guilty. He confronts his mother Gertrude about the fact that her husband is a murderer, and she says that he's not, and Hamlet notices that someone is watching them behind a curtain, and he thinks that it's Claudius, so he stabs him, but it's actually Polonius. So Laertes, who has this sort of strawberry blonde hair like his sister Ophelia, comes back and wants to kill Hamlet because Hamlet has killed his father and broken his sister's heart. Hamlet gets sent off on a ship by Claudius to be killed by spies, but because pirates take over the ship, he's able to save himself and get back to Denmark. There's a lot of Shakespearean phrases that have entered the English language, like "I must be cruel only to be kind." When Hamlet returns to Denmark, there's the famous scene of him holding up the skull and saying, "Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio," which everyone gets wrong and thinks that it's "I knew him well, Horatio." Horatio is his best friend who kind of supports him throughout all this chaos. Laertes wants to kill Hamlet, so he challenges him to a duel, but secretly Laertes and Claudius plan to definitely kill Hamlet by poisoning the tip of the sword that Laertes is going to use in the duel. But during the duel, they accidentally swap swords. They both get stabbed. At the same time, Gertrude drinks a poisoned cup that Claudius uses as a backup plan. When Laertes is stabbed, he reveals to Hamlet the plan that they had, so Hamlet kills Claudius before he dies in his best friend's arms. So this is all Hamlet's father's fault. I would also count Ophelia's suicide as being partly Hamlet's father's fault, because she drowns herself when Hamlet rejects her. The reason why I like this play, even though it's so tragic, is because The style is really beautiful. It's kind of partly the ugly medieval style that I've always found sickly, but also very pale and realistic, like Holbein's work. Claudius kind of looks like Henry VIII, so he's very fat and ugly. So it's one of those plays where everyone dies at the end, and I think it's particularly tragic because Laertes is kind of a hero, like Hamlet, so you're kind of on both of their sides, but they're going to try and kill each other, and I think that's what makes it really sort of exciting at the end. The next play is considered the greatest love story in English literature, even though it wasn't even invented by Shakespeare himself. When I found out that Shakespeare didn't actually originate his own stories, my opinion of him lowered quite a lot. And he also just lowered the ages, so he stole the story and then lowered their ages, which is really weird. But the reason why I like this play so much is because of the animation style. It's cell animation. I really wish they'd done this style for Othello, Julius Caesar and Macbeth, because they did this really brutal style for those plays. But for this one, they have the beautiful slash sleeve fashions and this sort of Punch and Judy look. So basically, Romeo and Juliet is a forbidden love because their families are feuding, they hate each other, and the prince of the town is just really fed up with them doing this all the time, so he bans them from fighting in the streets anymore. Romeo, along with his fun-loving best mates Benvolio and Mercutio, go to a Capulet party even though they're Montagues, but it's a masked ball, so they just wear their masks and no one recognises them. And that's where he meets Juliet, so he forgets about Rosaline, who he was lovesick for at the start of the play, ditches her, and then really likes Juliet, but they realise that they are from the two different families which are feuding. So Romeo goes to see Juliet and there's the famous balcony scene. They decide to get married the next day, which is very Disney. You get the sort of time changes with a clockwork monk that hits a bell. So it sort of changes from night to day. Romeo and Juliet get married. Romeo refuses to fight Tybalt in the street. Tybalt's a really angry Capulet. When he sort of notices that Romeo is probably a Montague at the ball, he's like, "Fetch me my rapier," because he's just always ready to fight. Mercutio fights Tybalt. He stabs him underneath Romeo's arm because Romeo was trying to stop the fight. Mercutio thinks it was Romeo's fault for not fighting Tybalt in the first place and trying to stop him. So Romeo then kills Tybalt. Romeo then gets banished and has to leave, which really upsets both him and Juliet, and the poor friar has to deal with them. He has to deal with these horny teenagers who are constantly threatening to commit suicide. I really love the way the friar runs. He sort of holds his robes up with one hand and is holding a lamp up in the other. And he says to Romeo at one point, "Speak plain," which is really funny because no one in Shakespeare speaks plainly. Juliet's parents arrange a marriage for her and says that they'll disown her if she doesn't agree to it, but she's already married to Romeo. So she goes to the friar, and the friar gives her this vial, which will help her appear dead for a few hours and then come back to life. And they send a message to tell Romeo that that is what has happened, so that he won't think that she's dead, but unfortunately they wouldn't let the messenger go through the gate. Romeo thinks that Juliet is definitely dead, and comes and commits suicide next to her body. She wakes up and then commits suicide over him, and then their families find their bodies and realise that their feud was really pointless because it has ended in the deaths of their daughter and son, and they make up. I don't think it's even ever explained why they're feuding, they've just feuded for centuries. This story has inspired countless love stories, including the musical West Side Story. At number 3 we have The Tempest, which I did in year 7 at school. It's one of the ones that is considered a romance because it doesn't quite fit into the other genres. Prospero, whose brother took his dukedom of Milan, has been living on an island with his daughter Miranda and has grown in magic. He's now a sorcerer with an amphibian gorilla creature called Caliban, who tried to rape Miranda at one point, and a fairy called Ariel as servants. He finally gets revenge by sending a storm to shipwreck the King of Naples on his island, enslaving his son Ferdinand, who Miranda immediately loves because he's the first guy she's ever met, and he happens to be a prince, which helps. And then Prospero's brother encourages the king's brother to take his example and kill the king now that they think that Ferdinand is dead. Caliban worships the butler who gets shipwrecked because the butler gives him alcohol, but like in the original Clash of the Titans, massive statues of Prospero's head on the island are alive and overhear what is going on, so they know the secret plan to kill Prospero. and Ariel, under instruction from Prospero, controls each group. Prospero trusts no one, he manipulates everyone including his daughter, and I think it's just because he's been so badly affected by being betrayed by his brother that he's become extremely controlling. So Ariel has been preventing the King of Naples' brother from killing him, and Prospero provides a feast for them, but then it turns into a nightmare and Ariel turns into this kind of giant harpy, a sort of eagle with a woman's face, and confronts them with what happened to Prospero after a sort of dance macabre. It's all very Ray Harryhausen with his sort of stop motion mythical creatures. It's also quite dreamlike, the whole story, and when Prospero finally gives his blessing to Ferdinand and Miranda, stops being horrible to Ferdinand, there's this random unicorn that appears and all these woodland creatures because they're really happy now. The story is narrated by amazing audiobook narrator Martin Jarvis, who I once met because I awkwardly waited for him after he'd been in The Importance of Being Earnest and asked him to sign my book of Swan Song from the Forsyte Saga because he played young John in the Forsyte Saga, and he very kindly signed it for me. At the end, Ariel was freed like the genie from Aladdin for her good service. Ariel looks very like a pixie with slanting eyes and a long turned up nose. Prospero throws his books into the sea and breaks his staff, giving up magic, which I think is really good for him because he was getting too power hungry, and a really awesome guitar plays at the same time. I think this story is probably more about magic. It's more surreal than a romance because it kind of makes you question if life is an illusion. I think Caliban worshipping the butler shows really well how human nature can kind of decide that someone is worth worshipping and actually they're just foolish and not worth giving respect to at all. I think it's really unfair on Miranda that she has to see Caliban every day. It's weird how Prospero is kind of vindictive. He's playing games with all these people who hurt him long ago, but at the same time, he really should have punished Caliban and put him in prison rather than enslaving him so Miranda still has to see him every day. Prospero is a very odd character. I would almost see him as an anti-hero because I think making your daughter sleep when you want her to and waking up when you want her to based on your sort of secretive magic plans is really weird. I think he shows you how having too much power can be really bad for a man. He is tempted too much to manipulate the people who should be close to him in his life and who he should have respect for. Now we come to The Taming of the Shrew, which I studied in sixth form, and I probably discovered this series from looking up The Taming of the Shrew on YouTube. Baptista has two daughters who are total opposites. Katharina is rebellious and bad-tempered. She wears red and her hair flares up when she's angry, so it's kind of like Medusa's snakes. And then Bianca is very demure. She's wearing this Princess and the Pauper dress and it's blue with sort of pink roses. It's very pretty, but she's also a total suck-up to her father. And the father has a problem basically because no one wants to marry Katharina. Everyone wants to marry Bianca. So what he does is says that Bianca can't marry until Katharina is married. One of Bianca's suitors has a friend called Petruchio who's a total gold digger. He looks like a cavalier, he has these long black locks and is wearing a feathered hat. Petruchio says that he is going to marry Katharina. He doesn't care what he's heard about her personality. So he goes to see Baptista, and the first he sees of Kate is her throwing a pot at him from the balcony above, and he sort of stares at her, and then Baptista leaves them to it, and they sort of argue, they verbally spar, and they also sort of flamenco dance. It's kind of a metaphor for how they're sparring and sort of testing each other out. Petruchio begins taming her by turning up at the wedding in this really odd outfit, and that's really embarrassing to her, and then he doesn't let her eat the wedding feast. He whisks her away, and he basically spends the whole time gaslighting her and abusing her by depriving her of sleep and food. It's very transactional. She ends up submitting to him in order to get food and clothes and a decent rest. So that's tyranny, really. He's treating her really badly, like an animal. He gaslights her so much that he makes her say that the sun is the moon and the moon is the sun. And he thinks he's doing really well. He sort of presents it as this lesson, teaching men how to dominate women. It's really hypocritical the way he says that their clothes don't matter because he's not allowing her to have new clothes, because he only married her for her money, so he's incredibly mercenary. So to say that she should only care about him as her husband and not about clothes is really hypocritical. I don't buy that Shakespeare is some sort of proto-feminist. That long speech at the end that Katharina gives about being grateful to your husband is pretty damning. But I think that the framing of the Lord playing a joke on Christopher Sly takes the edge of it somewhat. He's making fun of him and presenting The Taming of the Shrew as a play, so it isn't real, which is nice, but also it's very much presenting a way for men to be able to dominate women. And I don't think it's showing that somehow there's a secret understanding between Kate and Petruchio, because they have scenes where it's just them, so he still treats her very badly in those scenes. Petruchio is very much victorious at the end. He wins a bet and he gets loads of money, and he also has a submissive wife. I don't think it's really poking fun at Petruchio at all, and I don't think domestic abuse as comedy is feminism. It feels more like a study of English culture at the time, the fact that you could have a comedy on this topic and that no one would bat an eyelid about it, even though Queen Elizabeth was on the throne at the time. So the reason why I like this play is because it's worded really well. It's got sort of bouncing iambic pentameter, the plot moves along very quickly, and the phrases are really nicely done. I also really like the animation, so sort of ignoring the story more and kind of concentrating on the stop motion, which is really beautifully done. My favourite Shakespeare play from this series is The Winter's Tale. This is about King Leontes of Sicily, who has gone mad with baseless jealousy just like Othello. I think it's also a bit like Hercules when he kills his wife and children because Hero has put a temporary madness on him. He thinks that his wife is slippery, which is in the scene select. My wife is slippery, and I think it's a hilarious line. But what he means is that he thinks she's untrustworthy because he thinks that she is sleeping with his best friend, Polixenes. So he sends the Lord Camillo to kill Polixenes, but instead Camillo ditches because he can see that Leontes is mad and that Polixenes is innocent, so they both go to Bohemia instead. Leontes' wife Hermione is pregnant, and when she gives birth, Paulina shows the king his daughter, but because he believes that it is Polixenes' daughter, and he is also having these kind of Night on Bald Mountain demons possessing him, he wants to kill the child. Paulina is an amazing best friend of Queen Hermione, and she does just not care. When he says, "I'll have thee burnt," she's like, "I care not." Because she wasn't able to flee, Hermione goes on trial, but the oracle declares her innocent, and Leontes doesn't believe it. The oracle declares that Leontes will have no heir until Perdita is found, so they find out that Leontes and Hermione's son is dead now. Paulina says that Hermione also died, kind of in shock from hearing that her son has died. And then Paulina's husband sees her ghost when he is taking Leontes' daughter away because he's managed to persuade him not to have her killed. He actually goes to Bohemia and unfortunately exits pursued by a bear. So he's eaten by a bear, but the child lives and is adopted by a shepherd and his son. The personification of time, she kind of looks like the Snow Queen, says that it has been 16 years. Polixenes now has a son, Florizel, and he's very angry because Florizel has been going to see Perdita. Perdita is the name that the ghost of Hermione told Antigonus to call her daughter. So Polixenes is very angry because Florizel has been doing this behind his back, and then says that he doesn't care about his father's permission when Polixenes goes with Camillo, disguised, and says he disowns him. And Camillo tells the young couple to go back to Sicily. The young couple go back, and Leontes says he'll help them because he is now repentant. In fact, he says to Paulina that they can't get married until my daughter is returned. And I thought that he meant him and Paulina had fallen in love over the years, but actually I think he means the royal we, or him and his demons. And especially since Paulina actually ends up with Camillo, since her husband died, eaten by a bear. Leontes gets a happy ending too because Hermione, as a statue, comes back to life, so it's all quite mystical and magical, very like The Tempest, and has similarly sort of eerie, beautiful music. The stop motion is really wonderful. It focuses on sort of gentle movements that suddenly start and stop. It's really like the emotion of a ballet. Untrustworthy characters like Autolycus, the conman, doesn't obey the laws of physics in the same way, so his animation isn't as nice, and it reflects that he isn't a good character. I'd never seen this play before watching the animation, and I think it's kind of unclassifiable. It's counted as a romance like The Tempest, because it's kind of comedic and tragic at the same time. It's definitely not a history. I think it's more like a psychological drama. You really feel for Leontes, and I think it is very like Hercules because it's not really his fault that he's gone mad. Whether with Petruchio, when he's acting like a tyrant, he is in his own sound mind. He's just acting out of selfishness. I would say the story is mostly tragic, but because it has a happy ending, it is more like a comedy play. We got shown the Macbeth from this series in year 8 when we were studying Macbeth, and I think it's a great introduction to Shakespeare plays. It's just such a shame that they couldn't do all of the plays, although I'm glad they didn't do something like Titus Andronicus, which is really bloody, or something befuddling like Much Ado About Nothing, although it was very well modernised in Shakespeare Retold. I think honourable mentions for my top 5 would be The Tudor Propaganda, Richard III, and Twelfth Night. That is also a puppet stop animation, and I really liked She's the Man growing up, and that is based on Twelfth Night.